Let's go to the Federal Reserve, and here we have a fellow named Paul Volcker. First of all, he joined the Council on Foreign Relations in 1970. And if you don't know about the Council on Foreign Relations, please find out about it. We have the book, The Shadows of Power, over there. These are the people who run our country. The Shadows of Power will tell you who they are and how they operate. In 1979, he was named to be the head of the Federal Reserve. During his testimony to Congress, they have a quasi-relationship with Congress. He said, the standard of living of the average American has to decline. I don't think you can escape that. Alan Greenspan in the 60s was a hard money gold bug. And in a book he wrote, in the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. He's absolutely right about that. But then he joined the Council on Foreign Relations in 1978, and then he was named chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1987, and he did that for 20 years. These are the kind of men. And that they come from the Council on Foreign Relations is no surprise. Today it's Ben Bernanke. He's not yet a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, but he's a Greenspan disciple. In 1993, a man I knew in Pennsylvania finally got his congressman to do something. He had been badgering the man. Where does the Fed get the authority to do what it's doing? And the congressman couldn't answer. In fact, most congressmen can't answer. So the congressman finally wrote to Greenspan, and he said, please help me out here. And you can see this letter. It came back from the Federal Reserve, and that's Alan Greenspan's name there, and that's his signature down at the bottom. He said, consequently, while no state government may emit bills of credit or make anything but gold or silver a legal tender in payment of debts, the federal government is not limited in what it may designate as legal tender and do what it's doing. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that needs a very big explanation, all right? We said at the beginning that the Constitution of the United States empowers government with very few functions. In fact, of all of the things that governments have done throughout history, the Constitution of the United States empowered our government to do 5% of them. In other words, you are barred from 95% of what governments like to do. If you have Greenspan's attitude, however, he says that if we are not prohibited from doing something in this, we can go ahead and do it. And that means that he will now do 95% of things that governments throughout history have wanted to do. That is a marvelous transformation, and that is the attitude of many people in the Congress of the United States today. My own congressman, I recently asked him about it. He said, well, we're not permitted from doing it, so we can go ahead and do it. I hope you grasp how important that is. Now, Greenspan's not the only one who said that. Franklin Roosevelt said that. A lot of others have said that. But here we have it in print. The Federal Reserve, an unelected few, appointed to its Board of Governors by the President for 14-year terms, have been awarded completely unconstitutional power to decide the amount of currency, establish the value of the currency, set the interest rates on it, and create booms and busts. The Federal Reserve is the brainchild of Edward Mandell House. House was President Woodrow Wilson's top advisor. He wrote in his own 1912 book, Philip Drew Administrator, that he was working for, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. It was House who later founded the Council on Foreign Relations. When the U.S. Senate said no to the League of Nations that he and Wilson tried to promote, they decided to form an organization to persuade the American people to want world government. That's what the Council on Foreign Relations is. And of course, if we get world government, you can scrap what's in this little book. We will now be under the United Nations. I put a quote at the bottom here from the famous leader of the Rothschild banking empire. Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws. Because if I control the nation's money, the people who write the laws will do what I want. That's what he said. And that is so true. There were a few who saw the danger in 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr. of Massachusetts, he said, the bill as it stands seems to me to open the way to a vast inflation of the currency. Charles Lindbergh, the father of the famous aviator, was a Republican congressman from Minnesota. He said the new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. And remember what I said. You give anybody the power to inflate, and he will. You can count on it. Then we see Wright Patman, a Democrat from Texas, 1968. He's the powerful head of the House Banking Committee. And he said in the United States today, we have in effect two governments. We have the duly constituted government. Then we have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve. He, as the head of the House Banking Committee, was saying he had no influence over the Federal Reserve. He had no power to control what they were doing. They are an independent government, he said. And yes, they are. And they still are today. It was only a little while ago that the Congress of the United States decided to raise the national debt ceiling. They raised it to $10.2 trillion, 10.2 trillion. They're almost there. Now, Paulson and Bernanke want the government to give $700 billion more to use to bail out their friends, yes, right? To supposedly stop the bleeding of the U.S. economy, which it might do for a couple of months, that's all. And so they've also asked Congress to raise the debt ceiling to $11 trillion. All during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the American people were living high on the hog, and we were all doing well, and everybody was happy. It was a prosperous country. You know, don't worry about the Federal Reserve. You know, whatever they're doing is fine with me. I don't care. Now people are beginning to care. The chickens have come home to roost. We talked about Marx and the fact that Edward Mandell House got his cue from Marx, and he said it in his own book. He was working for socialism, as dreamed of by Karl Marx. The Communist Manifesto, famous 10 planks. Number 2, a heavy progressive income tax. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. That's the Fed, except that we've gone one step beyond even what Marx wanted. He wanted it in the hands of the state. Ours is in the hands of a private entity known as the Federal Reserve. You've all seen an individual tax return, so let's talk about income tax for a while. It accounts for 40% of government revenue. Where does the other 60% come from? Well, it comes from legitimate taxation. There is a form of taxation in the government, excise taxes and so forth. And it comes from borrowing. Now, if they borrow, where do they borrow from? Right now, they're borrowing from China. They're borrowing from China. Communist China. Richard Nixon dignified the Chinese, and the Chinese have taken advantage of the dignity supplied, and now they are the United States creditor. And so the billions and billions that China is lending to the United States has put our nation in another noose. Now go back to what happened regarding money. President Roosevelt took us off the gold standard. President Lyndon Johnson took us off the silver standard. But until 1971, the American people couldn't exchange their dollars for gold, but foreigners could. Actually, foreigners could. Maybe you remember the term gold flow. Our gold was leaving the country. Foreigners were cashing in their dollars and taking the gold. They were emptying Fort Knox. And it was Richard Nixon that put an end to that and cut forever any tie of U.S. currency to precious metal. The same man who went to China and dignified Chu Enlai and Mao Zedong, the bloodiest murderers the world has ever known. Ever.